Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Centre for Independent Studies. It's a great pleasure to see you here tonight, and thank you for joining us. Professor Paul Oslington is Professor of Economics and Dean of Business at Alphacrucis College, and also Adjunct Professor of Theology at ACU, Professor of Economics, I beg your pardon, at ACU. In his work, Paul combines in, I think, a very interesting way the fields of religion and economics, and has written extensively about religion and economics. He uses his discipline and training in economics to range quite widely across the disciplines, and brings, I think, in a very interesting way, an economic analysis to bear on a range of topics. I'm Peter Curti. I'm a research fellow in the Religion and Free Society program. It is under the auspices of that program that Paul is here tonight to talk about something that's slightly different, it's away from the field of economics, but goes very much to the heart of his academic and personal concerns, and that is the place of religion in Australian societies. The subtitle is A Tale of Horror and Hope. He will tell us more about that. Will you please welcome Paul Oslington?
Thank you, Peter. I'm really pleased to be doing this as part of the Religion and Free Society program, which is a innovation, well, not really an innovation, a resurrection of something that CIS has been doing actually for a long time, and shows that CIS is ahead of the game, certainly ahead of the universities in this regard, in recognising the importance of religion in our society. So it's a great pleasure to be here tonight under the auspices of the Religion and Free Society program. What I plan to do tonight is offer an argument with a bit of context about the history of the Australian university system. What I want to suggest is that we have a higher education system in Australia, and that includes the teaching side and the research side, which is less than the best system we could have. I think that's for a mixture of ignorance of religion, which is profound in contemporary Australia, and self-interest. We can talk more about some of the politics of this later. But what I'd like to do is firstly outline the historical context, because to understand where religion is in our universities today, you have to understand some of the peculiar history of our system, and in relation to things that are going on in Britain and other things. So after offering that historical background, I'd then like to compare the Australian higher education system with the secondary system. The secondary system has attracted a lot of attention recently. I think higher education's been somewhat neglected politically. So I think it's good to compare higher education with secondary education. I'd then like to have a look at some funding issues on the student side, and particularly on the research side. And I have some findings there from a study of every ARC grant that's ever been awarded, which I think will be, which people will be quite surprised by. And finally, offer some suggestions on what needs to be done to give us a better system, a system that properly recognises the importance of religion to major issues that Australia is facing. So that's where we're going tonight. I'll speak for 25 minutes, half an hour, and then, as Peter said, there'll be ample time for questions after that. So firstly, now the history of our higher education system with a particular focus on religion. I mean, I could talk all night about this. It's lots of fascinating byways, but I'd like to stick to a few main threads. Let's start with the foundation of the University of Sydney in 1852, Australia's first university, as you can see in their publicity brochures. Big sandstone building, Australia's first, etc., etc. And there's many things about the foundation of the University of Sydney that run through the rest of the system. The University of Sydney was founded excluding teaching of theology. Now, you might be inclined to think that that was because they wanted to keep our education system being polluted by the hocus pocus and otherwise damaging, nasty thing of theology or religion or something like that. But that wasn't the case. The University of Sydney was founded by mostly profoundly religious men, not universally, but mostly lay Anglicans, and the teaching of theology was kept out of the university for religious reasons. They didn't want the university to be a rolling fight between clerics of various denominations. They wanted a university that developed young people in all ways, including religious, free of the curse of denominational conflict. So the University of Sydney was founded for religious reasons, excluding the teaching of theology. The churches were given colleges for housing and forming students in their own religious traditions. So the Anglicans had St Paul's College, the Presbyterians St Andrews, the Catholics St John's, etc., etc. So I think that's the first big fact about our system, that there was a separation, but it was a separation for religious reasons. Remember the background, the English background. In the early 19th century in Britain, there were huge squabbles over the admission of Catholics to the old universities, Oxford and Cambridge. And then when you're fighting about what to do about the Catholics, there's the issue of what to do about the nonconformists as well. So it was a bit of a mess. So the universities founded at that time, they were very keen to avoid those sort of interdenominational squabbles. So it was a separation of theology from the university system for religious reasons. That was mirrored with the foundation of the University of Melbourne, 1854, and then the later Act. There was more theology teaching went on in the colleges down in Melbourne, but there was always a strong separation between the university side and the college side. Melbourne College of Divinity was founded in 1910. It had its own Act of Parliament, and it taught theology because Melbourne University was not allowed to. In the background as well was the Australian College of Theology, founded in 1891. So it was a national association of Anglican theological colleges, still around and thriving academically today. So we had a growing separation in the early 20th century between our university system and the teaching of theology in denominational colleges. At that time, most people who were studying theology were male, reasonably young, looking to be ordained in their various denominations. So that's the first phase, the separation that we had between the teaching of religion, theology, and other subjects. A new phase in the later 20th century, I guess, marked by the Martin Report in 1964. And two things are particularly relevant around that time for the place of theology. Firstly, foundation of new universities. So opened up new possibilities. But also the Martin Report suggesting that it was perfectly appropriate for universities to, and this is a strange expression, to be teaching theologically relevant courses of a non-dogmatic character. So not only was it appropriate for them to be teaching such courses, but also for such courses to be funded. And so gradually you had theology creeping into the universities. You had universities like Flinders, Murdoch, beginning to teach theology. UQ had done so for a while. You had the beginning of theological consortia in the 1970s. The Adelaide College of Divinity formed to kind of mirror the Melbourne College of Divinity, founded in 1979, and eventually similar consortia in other states. A big change was the government moving towards funding student load. And that was important for theology education because enterprising arts deans realised that the Theological College down the road was a great source of FTSUs, which is the sort of management speak for students in the current system. So if you could sign up the local denominational theological college as the Department of Religion or Theology or something in your university, then large cheques from the government would hit your bank account, and deans like that sort of thing. So for purely financial reasons, you had these sort of marriages. I don't know what, you don't call them shotgun marriages, you call them, I guess, wad of cash marriages or something, between theological colleges and universities. And they were it was interesting to have a look at some of the negotiations. I mean, I'm most familiar with the experience at St Mark's, which married Charles Sturt University. And just seeing how the negotiations between theological colleges and universities proceeded. The St Mark's settlement ended up being basically that the Anglicans still paid the salaries of the faculty, still covered most of the costs, and Charles Sturt got most of the money. Maybe that says something about theologians' capacities to negotiate hard compared to university deans. But it was felt that it was necessary to maintain the integrity, particularly over appointments. And the only way that the Anglican Church could maintain control over appointments was to maintain control over appointments. So you had this phase where theology was gradually moving into the universities. A very interesting one was the closure of the Anglican College of the Diocese of Newcastle, St John's College in Morpeth, which closed, and the funds were used to endow a chair in theology at University of Newcastle. So that was a far more meaningful move of theology into the university system than these marriages between colleges and arts faculties of universities. Then you had on the Catholic side the foundation of ACU in Australian Catholic University in 1991 was more or less the sort of cobbling together of teacher training and nursing schools, and it gradually looked more and more like a university as the years went on. The foundation of the University of Notre Dame, private Catholic university in 1999, and the stories to be told about that, but that's not our main subject tonight. And Campion College in the year 2000, a Catholic liberal arts college. So interesting developments through the 80s and the 90s. And I think there's tentative steps to bring theology and the university system together, but problematic, tentative and problematic, I'd say. So that would be the second phase, I think, of the history. The third phase, really since about 1990, I think marked by two things: great changes in what was going on in theological colleges. Now you had the mode theology student not being a smart-looking, clean-shaven 20-year-old looking to go into Anglican ministry or something like that, but now probably 55, female, part-time, doing some sort of research degree in theology. Huge changes in the population in theological colleges. Roughly now 20% of theology students of FTSUs in theology are training for ordained ministry. So massive changes in the theological colleges themselves. But then on the government side and the university side, we've got the increasing importance of research, and and theologians tentatively putting their toes in the national research system. Melbourne College of Divinity began offering PhDs, began in 1990, obtained access to the research funding system in 2002, and eventually took the step to seek accreditation as a university in 2010. It's now renamed the University of Divinity, the only university of specialisation, it's called, in Australia, because we think of a university as having lots of disciplines. So this is a beast that teaches just theology. In fact, they've had to drop some of their non-theology offerings as a result of becoming a university of specialisation. So again, we could have a discussion about the wisdom or otherwise of that move. There are obvious disadvantages. It cuts you off in some ways from the rest of the system, being a specialised university out on its own teaching theology, but we're not going to pursue that one tonight. The point I want to make is that the theological colleges are joining the research world. And there's strong incentives to do that because of the amount of research funding that's sloshing around in this period. The move towards PhDs, graduate degrees, becoming more important and being funded quite generously by the government. You also had theological colleges developing ethics centres. Theologians were very keen in these days to engage with contemporary life. And so an obvious way of doing that was to form a committee. The Anglicans are very good at forming committees, but they also started some little research centres. So almost every theological college had a garage at the back with a bloke sitting in his office writing papers on social ethics, more or less out of contact with everyone else doing that in Australia, and certainly out of contact with the mainstream research scene. But it was a commendable move in some ways. Interesting also was the beginning of a thing called the National Church Life Survey, which I think is another sign of the engagement of the churches with the national research system. Macquarie Christian Studies Institute, that some people here will remember with a mixture of fondness and tears, I think was a wonderful experiment at Macquarie University in trying to engage with wider intellectual life in Australia. Other examples, Wesley Institute, which has a vision, is in some ways a bit of a Protestant Campion college. It's a liberal arts college, trying to do integrative education, particularly in creative arts, teacher training, some other areas. But the owners of Wesley Institute have just sold to Indiana Wesleyan University, and it's interesting to see whether that will just become a tourist destination for Indiana undergraduates who like drinking beer on the beach rather than wading through the snow in Indiana. But it did seem to be a commendable initiative in higher education. Of course, Alphacrucis College, the institution that I've been part of for the last year, very much enjoyed being part of that. We're moving towards university status. My job there has been to start a business faculty alongside an education faculty. And I think good things are happening there, but I'm not going to spend 10 minutes of my time giving you an extended advertisement for the wonders of Alphacrucis, great though they are. So we have I think a far more meaningful engagement now of the theological colleges and some sections of the church with mainstream academic life in Australia. That's the point we're at. So I think there's been some engagement, but I suggested at the beginning that there are problems. We don't have the system that we could have. Instructive to think briefly, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, thinking about Christian schooling. And I think this is something where the government can look at the consistency of its policies. At the secondary level, we have an emphasis on choice, local autonomy, innovation. That seems to be the policy direction for secondary education. There has been now for decades government support of private secondary education, most of it, historically at least, associated with the churches. Contrast that with higher education, where the universities have a government-enforced monopoly position, a highly unionised, a highly inefficient government-supported monopoly. It's very interesting to contrast the policy settings in secondary education with the policy settings in higher education. We might leave that one there. No more could be said. So that's a comparison of of secondary with higher education. One other point where I find it hard to appreciate the consistency of government policy is in the funding of student load. One of the things I teach in an economic policy course, and I've spent most of my time in universities, Australian Catholic University, and before that University of New South Wales, teaching economics. We teach about competition policy and principles of competitive neutrality. Now, I think if you look at competitive neutrality, let's look at a private provider. Private provider will receive absolutely $0 from the government for educating a student. Outside a few disciplines where some institutions have been able to negotiate a special deal, primarily education and nursing. It seems pretty random, mostly to do with the political connections of the institutions that are doing the negotiating. But on the whole, private providers, although they have to satisfy the same accreditation standards as the public universities, receive $0 for educating students. It's my contention, and you could read my Quadrant article of a year or so ago, that standards in the private providers are actually a lot higher than their competitors mostly at the bottom end of the system. For instance, at Alphacrucis, no one can get into any of our courses with a TER of less than 65, and there are substantial numbers of university students entering with TERs in the 30s and 40s. At certain universities, it's pretty common knowledge that it's impossible to fail courses. You more or less just have to be able to write your name legibly and know someone who can read an examination timetable, and you're in. Any suggestion at Alphacrucis or some of the other private colleges with which I'm familiar, any suggestion of that sort of laxity of standards, it just would not fly. So I think, and students recognise this. We have students who are prepared to recognise the quality difference between the better private institutions and the bottom end of the university system. Students that are paying out large amounts of cash, and we're not talking about well-off students here. Now we're talking about students who really struggle to put together the money. But students who can get into public universities are outlaying significant sums of money to attend private higher education institutions. Sometimes that's because of the church connections and the formation they're receiving in private colleges, but mostly it's just due to the quality differences which are becoming increasingly obvious. So if private providers can compete, receiving $0 subsidies and a lot of hassle from the regulatory bodies, what does that say about the relative efficiency and the quality of the product offered by the bottom end of our system? Now, I think that if there was free competition, if there was actual implementation of the principles of competitive neutrality, universities at the bottom end of the system would be in a hell of a lot of trouble. So why can't we have competitive neutrality in higher education as we have in almost every other sector of the economy? I think the government would get significantly better value for money out of its higher education dollar, and Australians would get, I think, in many cases, a better education. So that's the funding of student load. The thing which I find most puzzling is the research funding discrepancies between private providers and public universities. The Australian Research Council excludes almost all private providers from applying for the Australian Research Council grants. Somewhat curious, because research is a key part of the path to university status, yet private providers are excluded from even applying for ARC grants. Curious indeed. If you did, one of the arguments is that private providers don't have the capacity to support research. Remember that the Australian College of Theology is older than most of the universities and has produced a line of distinguished scholars. And you could point to example at Alphacrucis. I believe we have one of the brightest groups of young scholars of any institution I've worked. And I've worked at some, I've been a visitor at distinguished overseas universities, and have worked at and studied at some of Australia's top-end universities. I don't think you can make the argument that the quality of research done at many private institutions is less than the quality of research done at public universities. And in any case, the infrastructure available to support research is an increasingly significant part of the ARC selection criteria. So surely we should allow private institutions access to the ARC system, and any deficiencies in their research infrastructure capacity can be compensated for through that criteria. I think it's absolutely indefensible to be excluding, to having a university monopoly of ARC funding. Even if you do get into the ARC system, if you're one of those lucky institutions, Melbourne College of Divinity, for instance, that is a theological provider, a theological institution that is allowed to apply for ARC funding, it doesn't look too good. Now, I'm happy to make available the supporting data for this, and I've consulted extensively with some of the senior people in the ARC over these statistics, so I think they're pretty solid. From the beginning of the ARC in 2002 until 2013, there have been approximately 38 grants in religion. So that's searching religion codes, and it's also doing some other keyword searches to pick up grants which aren't necessarily coded religion, because coding your application as religion is not a good thing for your success rate. You can't code it as theology, but if you could, it would be the death of it, probably. Okay. But there have been 38 grants in religion, which represents 0.02% of grants and 0.01% of funds dispersed by the ARC. Theology grants tend to be little, so that's why they're a larger proportion of grants than funds. So that's religion, defined fairly broadly. If we look at theology, there have been 2 grants that would be recognised by a mainstream theologian as theological research. One of them in the first year of the ARC, to an ACU person to do some work on feminist ecological readings of John's Gospel, and in more recent times a large fellowship given to distinguished academic in Western Australia to do some work on New Testament understandings of homosexuality. Those have been the 2 recognisably theological grants. Okay. So you have 0.2% of grants, 0.1% of funding. If you look for some benchmarks, is 0.2% a large number or a small number? Well, 2.7% of books produced by Australian academics are in theology. 0.4% of refereed journal articles are produced by theologians, and theology academics are 0.3% of staff who are eligible to apply for ARC grants, and 0.9% of all academic staff in our system. So those numbers are significantly lower. The amounts of money being awarded and the number of grants being awarded are significantly lower than any of those benchmarks, staffing, publication output, etc. So there really does seem to be a problem with ARC grants, and we're just talking about the ones in religion. I mean, the ones in theology hardly even hit the scale. 2 grants out of thousands. If you have a look at the content of the religion grants, it's very interesting as well. And the ARC tends to give money for 2 things. Okay, grants about Islam. It's about how Muslims are going to blow us up and how we need to understand how to stop them blowing us up by sort of promoting, good forms of Islam, or doing various things that stop people in tea towels blowing us up. So that seems to be the understanding of Islam within the ARC, revealed by their allocation of grants. And Christianity. Christianity is a terrible thing for young people. Really mucks up, particularly gay and lesbian young people. Christianity has all sorts of baleful effects, and many of the grants which have been awarded have been for documenting the baleful effects of Christianity on Australia. So I think that's generalisation, but I think it's a reasonably supportable generalisation looking at the details of the grant. And I'm happy to give you my spreadsheet if you want to have a look for yourself. I must say that the ARC has been, we had a workshop last year gathering a lot of the key people in religion and theology, and senior people from the ARC engaged very generously with us over some of these issues. And there are things that can be done within ARC processes to fix it up, particularly as regards the assessor pool and some of the coding rules and that sort of thing. So I'd like to acknowledge the generous engagement of senior ARC executives who came along to our workshop and helped us with some of the data. The key issue, though, is political. It's access to the ARC funding pool for theologians, and theologians tend to be not at universities, particularly fairly traditional theologians. So it's in the end a political call about whether theologians have access to ARC money and have access to funding for PhDs. So one of the curious things is you can go to a PhD in theology at Charles Sturt University, and the university picks up $60,000, and then the Australian College of Theology down the road, you go there and the university receives $0. So you've got a real bleed of students towards the universities just because of this strange twist of the funding arrangements. That and the ARC access really needs to be fixed, I think, as a matter of urgency, and the fix has to be political. It's not within the ARC's power to do that. Okay, so I think there are some really big problems with the treatment of religion and theology in our university system at the moment. Why do we need religion? Well, you perhaps don't need convincing of that if you come along here tonight. We need a discussion of religion, maybe because religion is such a terrible thing, or because you think religion is actually quite a good thing. But think about it. Australian graduates are operating in an increasingly globalised world. That sounds good, doesn't it? And in our global economy, now religion is a big part of a lot of the most complicated problems. And so surely we should be well equipping our graduates with an understanding, not a superficial understanding, but a deep understanding of religion.
Well, critical thinking, surely.
Indeed. The UK has recognised this. Now, the UK, for instance, has had a very large religion and society program jointly between the Humanities Research Council and the Social Science Research Council. And it's pretty clear that there's been support not just from religious academics, but from a support engagement from right across the university system in this project. I think particularly if we're talking about engagement with Asia, the Asians don't get our funny separation between religion and everything else. They find it puzzling, and I think an Australian university system that looks towards Asia with that strong division is not going to cut it. So if Julie Bishop was talking about engagement with Asia, then let's have deep engagements, which includes engagement with the incredibly and growing religiosity of Asia and Africa. So I've pointed out some things which I think are wrong with the current arrangements, some changes that I think need to be made by the government. But I think in this sector, the government is not the only agent of change. I think there's enormous potential for mobilisation of philanthropic support to transform the teaching and research in religion in Australia. It's been under-supported by the government. There's a chance for foundations, for individuals to step in and shape the future of this area in Australia. So I'll leave it there, Peter. I think we're bang on half an hour, which leaves us time for questions. And just one final reflection before we move to questions. I think internationally, and I see this at Alphacrucis, and I think what we're doing at Alphacrucis is important, and what we're doing in Australia with religion in the universities is important worldwide. America, debates about religion, well better informed, are often poisoned by the sort of political polarisation that you've got there. People shout, well-informed people shouting at it, and sometimes not well-informed people shouting loudly at each other. In Europe, in old Europe, religion is so tied up with the history of conflict that you tend to get entrenched positions. Now, Australia, partly because we haven't had we're new at this game of engaging intellectually with religion. We're not subject to either of those disadvantages that the US and Europe has. Now, we have a capacity to come up with some new ways of relating religion and other disciplines. And those new ways of relating in religion and other disciplines are going to be awfully important as the religiously vital societies of or societies where religion is growing and changing and really important politically and economically. Whatever we can come up with in Australia about relations between religion and other areas of life, including business, I think can be a real service to those countries can help them better deal with some of their own conflicts as they develop further. So that's kind of the hope in the topic. There's a lot of criticism and a lot of horror stories, I think, in tonight's lecture. But I think there is, if we can get this right in Australia, we have the potential to lead the world in this area and offer something to other countries. So with that concluding thought, I'll hand over to Peter, who's going to be joining me as we take questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Paul. And what you say, of course, is grounded not just in, as it were, a sphere of academic inquiry, but very much in your own experience of having worked in institutions that have a grounding in the churches in one way or another.